Enterprise Management 360.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tech Chat. Now in today's episode, I'm being joined by Chris Morales, who is the Head of Security Analytics at Vectra. So Chris, welcome to Tech Chat and thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks a lot. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And if you wouldn't mind giving our viewers at home a little bit of background on yourself before we delve into today's topic.
Yeah, sure. Chris Morales, Head of Security Analytics at Vectra. I've been in cybersecurity, I realized shockingly, about 20 years now. This is the only career I've actually had. Interestingly enough, I realized I started this when I was 22 with Internet Security Systems, who we did that for 9 years, was bought by IBM. That's IBM Security today. So before anybody cared, I was involved, and I've spent my life looking at security operations, incident response, and breaches inside networks.
Well, it's a good industry to be in. You're never going to be bored, and there's always going to be something going on. And that's what we're here to talk about today, because obviously a lot is happening in the world at the moment. Everyone knows COVID has kind of accelerated a lot of issues. It's accelerated cloud adoption, for one thing, across all of these industries. But with this kind of rapid rate of shifting, there's been a harrowing problem that's emerged from all of this that really needs addressing. And that's the transferring of healthcare data to the cloud. And that's really led to a wider attack surface, which is a massive issue and needs narrowing sooner rather than later. So Chris is going to help us understand this a little bit more and give his expertise on the matter. And the first question I wanted to ask you, Chris, is if you could set the scene and explain why this shift has happened in the first place.
Yeah, sure. And I think the key word you said was, of course, accelerating. Candidly, we all knew the cloud was happening. It was just in different industries, it happens faster than others. Like the technology industry, early adopter of everything, embraces it, obviously, looks at different things. But then you have other industries like healthcare and actually things like finance, who were a little more measured about what they're doing, because there's just a lot of thought needs to go into that. So cloud has already introduced itself in various ways to different people. The fact is that we all use cloud. The most obvious is like email. Simple thing, cloud drives and email and stuff like that. In our personal lives, the minute we went to mobile phones, it's all about a personal device in the cloud. That's been relatively the story in healthcare up until now. The way they've embraced cloud wasn't a direct, like, let's just go in and do everything remotely. It was more like, as they evolved with medical devices, a lot of those medical devices for analytics and for data would send back to some kind of cloud storage for high-speed performance, for combining things, remote support, things like that. So it was very specific piecemeal, and it was tied to very specific things. And as we talked to our healthcare customers over the last few years, what we actually learned, in fact, about a year ago, we did a report and looked at them. And the key concern was the proliferation of medical IoT and those devices, and having visibility to them and understanding where they exist and what they're doing, because they're brought in by healthcare professionals doing their job. That was their focus. Now, those had some cloud aspect to it, but largely the healthcare process, i.e. you and I, like regular people going to the hospital, we still went to the hospital. We still showed up and a doctor checked us. Personally, I can't say I've ever done telehealth yet. And what's funny is I was just looking at that today, like, oh, is this something I have to do now? That is something the healthcare industry all of a sudden had to think about, that unless you're really sick, you're not going to the hospital. And there's people that need to do regular things. So as we talked to our customers, they were like, look, it's not that we didn't look into this already, and it's not that it wasn't going to happen. It's that something that we were planning to 1 to 2 to 3 years, all of a sudden happened in 2 weeks. Cloud it's been a raging success, apparently, by the way, for most of them. And even like the NHS in the UK in particular made this incredibly fast pivot. The NHS is a very conservative industry. Like, they're a lot of politics, a lot of decisions before you start adopting technology and move. This is an interesting thing people don't talk about. So as COVID happened, a lot of vendors showed up in particular and said, hey, we're going to give you free services, like cloud services. Microsoft in particular did it, right? The NHS actually took the offer from Microsoft for free cloud services. These were made at business decisions. They're like, oh God, we have to start thinking about how to help patients. security teams were not involved in the discussion, and their long laid 1 to 2 to 3 year roadmaps just went out the window. So the good news is that we're able to get healthcare now, and telehealth seems to be mostly working, I guess. I haven't tried it out personally. The bad news is that all our data is now gone to who knows where. And it's interesting because as I talked to a lot of the existing teams within these healthcare organizations, they originally I went in going, so I've noticed that there's not an increase of attacks now. There might be targeted attacks, but they're not succeeding, but there's a lot of your data leaving. And the way they put it is like, the problem is we know that people are using the cloud for stuff, yet we actually don't know where and what they're doing. So a lot of these teams were just getting on top of their problems of these medical devices have now gone from being reactive to proactive the minute everything went out, and they have to start all over. So they've straight up told me they're behind. We don't know the problem, and nor do they. And that's what's actually scary. It's the visibility or the lack of. And now they got to start to map that out and go, what is actually happening? Because every doctor can do their own thing. Every person changes. Like it's inconsistent, and it happens so quickly. So there aren't enough answers to, well, how's that data being managed? How's it handled? Who has access? Was it encrypted? What's going on? Like, I don't think anybody can properly answer that question right now.
No, I 100% agree. And it's been, as you say, accelerated beyond belief for a lot of industries, which has been fantastic, especially for cloud service providers. They're having a great time at the moment. But as you say, there was this roadmap of plan of digital transformation that people had. And we spoke about it in the intro. There's this larger attack surface that's happening now. So walk me through how detrimental this can be to the healthcare sector and what kind of threats they are now opening themselves up to.
You almost have to think about the kind of information was there. So when I talk about medical devices, let's be more specific. It could be an insulin pump, for example, for somebody. It'll have specific data on the insulin pump and what it's collecting is going out. And there's different devices, and they go to these little private areas. So you have all these small little data lakes, so to speak, with the very specific data that could have been compromised. By the way, the medical device manufacturer could be compromised. Somebody gets on that device and gains information. What we're doing now, and you really think of telehealth, is doctors are asking patients to upload all their data into a single source. Now we're taking a large database of people and everything about them, and everything from blood records to previous health to all that, into one large pool. And what we know about attacks is they're opportunistic, and they go for the least amount of effort for the largest amount of return, which that's anybody doing a job, right? And to them, it's a job. So as this swells, what we always hear about in the cloud, well, I can add to that. What we also have learned over the last few years is the biggest issue in the cloud isn't actually vulnerabilities or malware, any of that. It's just pure misconfiguration and misunderstanding of how privileged access looks like to these cloud storages. The biggest thing through COVID has been remote desktop protocols and access to those. Like all of a sudden, everything's remote, but they weren't configured properly, so somebody starts searching for it. So you combine this misconfiguration problem with all of a sudden a huge database source of, if I'm correct, healthcare records are still the most valuable piece of information on the internet. I'll go double check that, but like a healthcare record is worth more than a credit card at this point. So you just built a huge volume. That's an obvious target is what it comes down to. And the fact that the security teams are still behind and don't even know if it's misconfigured or not.
And that misconfiguration, as the example you gave, costs companies millions. And it's not only that, but also data privacy leaks and everything that we've seen in the past from a lot of companies, and especially over the last couple of years as well. It's been, detrimental to a lot of organizations. And as you say, healthcare, one of the most important. So I guess the next and final question really is, where do they kind of go from here? What steps need to be taken to mitigate that newfound level of risk and reduce it to as much or as little as possible?
The simple answer is, as I said, being proactive was them getting ahead and guiding the business through the process of knowing how to use the cloud, where to manage it, because that's out the door. their process now needs to be one of visibility. So think of it as an unmanaged attack surface of cloud services. That's what it is. They need to understand what that is, which means they need to start approaching saying, let's start hunting. It's very much like threat hunting. Let's start hunting and looking at what things are used and start to document that. Why is it used? Who's using it? How's it set up? Like, these are all questions they have to ask proactively about it. Now we have to start thinking about, now, how do we find all this? And how do we validate who has access? When do they use it? And should they be using it?
Yeah, and that's key across a lot of organizations, but whether they follow that advice is another thing because of the work that goes into it, but it should definitely be the case.
Yeah. That's the manpower is absolutely the big question, right? Yeah. Whether they do it or not, what they should do is different than what they do. Mm-hmm. And not always their fault. They're pretty overloaded.
Exactly. It comes down to resource management at the end of the day. But if you take the steps early, then you're not having to deal with such a massive issue later on down the road. So, Chris, thank you very much for taking the time to walk us through all of this and explain it. It's been really great kind of having this conversation with you.
Absolutely. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you everyone who took the time to watch this episode. You can continue the conversation with us on our social medias at EM360 on Twitter and LinkedIn. Of course, always subscribe to this YouTube channel. And for more great daily content, head on over to em360tech.com.